I felt like I was in a fog. I was barely aware of what was going on. I felt the same way after my husband died. Not sure which way to turn, but at least I had my son. And he just took care of everything, including me. He took care of me. So even though my husband's death was devastating, at least I had my son. And then my son died. My very soul felt trapped in a downward spiral of darkness, and I couldn't escape. Stumbling through the streets for this funeral, I was lost in a complete fog. And then I saw a light shining through the darkness, the unmistakable light of a man coming towards me. Me. Why did he take time out for me? I don't know, but he did. And he told me not to cry. And suddenly, somewhere deep inside myself, I felt there was hope, and my tears stopped. Then he reached inside the coffin, and he told my son to get up. Everyone was silent, completely shocked by this man's actions. It was only a fraction of a second, but time seemed to stop in the wake of his command. I looked at my son's body, and I couldn't believe it. His eyes opened. He sat up. He started speaking. I had my son back. I had hope again. There was light back in my life.
Look at the clouds. Look at the birds flying. Look at all of your beautiful smiles. I will never get tired of looking in people's smiles or being able to look them in their eyes. You see, for 18 long years, I was a cripple, completely doubled over. I couldn't stand up straight, and I spent 18 years looking at people's feet or the ground, and I began to feel as worthless as the dirt that I was always looking at. But then, one Sabbath at synagogue, he saw me, and he told me to come forward. I couldn't imagine what he wanted with me, a woman and a cripple. I was so nervous, but I went. I couldn't see what was going to happen, and I couldn't look into his face to read his intent. My heart was pounding, not knowing why he had called me. But then, he laid his hands on me. And even though I couldn't see the kindness in his face, I could feel it in his touch. And when he touched me, he healed me, right there on the Sabbath. Now that really made people talk. But he didn't seem to care, and I certainly didn't. I was finally healed. I could stand up straight. I could finally, after 18 years, look someone in their eyes. I looked into those kind, compassionate eyes, those eyes that cared about me, crippled, worthless me, and I knew that he loved me. Praise God.
Two stories today. That's not unusual. Last Sunday was two stories, except those two stories were intertwined. They were really one and the same story. Today's two encounter stories aren't even in the same chapter. They are in the same book. Both of them are found in Luke's gospel, and I believe Luke's the only one to tell either of those stories. One is in Luke chapter 7, the other in Luke chapter 13. Not even in the same town. So why share both of them here this morning? Well, I'm glad you asked. I'm going to try to answer that question in a few moments. But let's go back and see how Luke tells these stories. We've read part of this already this morning. We've seen each story portrayed for us, and our hearts have been touched with some of the emotion of having a storyteller sharing those as though these individuals were sharing them themselves. I don't know how Luke learned these stories. Maybe Luke sat where we did. Maybe not on a bench with someone on a platform, but maybe across a simple kitchen table. Maybe Luke actually did speak to these women who spoke to us this morning. Or at least to one of the disciples who was nearby and who witnessed what happened. The first story in Luke chapter 7. We read, soon afterward, Jesus went with his disciples to the village of Nain, and a large crowd followed him. A funeral procession was coming out as he approached the village gate. The young man who had died was a widow's only son, and a large crowd from the village was with her. When the Lord saw her, his heart overflowed with compassion. Don't cry, he said. Then he walked over to the coffin and touched it, and the bearers stopped. Young man, he said, I tell you, get up. Then the dead boy sat up and began to talk. Jesus gave him back to his mother. Fast forward, I'm not sure how many days or weeks or months. 6 chapters in Luke's gospel. We do know it was on a Saturday. You said, wait, I thought it was the Sabbath. Now remember, the Sabbath was Saturdays, okay? Luke 13, verse 10. One Sabbath day, as Jesus was teaching in a synagogue, he saw a woman who had been crippled by an evil spirit. She had been bent double for 18 years and was unable to stand up straight. When Jesus saw her, he called her over and said, Dear woman, you are healed of your sickness. Then he touched her, and instantly she could stand straight. How she praised God. So what do these two stories have in common? Well, a lot of things. But the thing that initially caught my attention was in each of these stories, Jesus saw the need and initiated the healing. I think in every other story we've looked at so far, someone came to Jesus, sometimes fighting through the crowd, sometimes rushing because of the urgency of his sick daughter at home. People heard about Jesus, people came to Jesus, or heard Jesus was traveling through and climbed a tree to see him, or did something to go seeking. In each of these stories, Jesus saw the need and initiated the healing. For the woman whose son had died, Jesus is there as this procession is coming past, and it says, when the Lord saw her, his heart overflowed with compassion. He's the one who spoke first. He's the one who said, don't cry. He's the one who walked over to the coffin and stopped the procession and called for this young man to get up. We don't hear this story much. It's no less miraculous than Jesus standing at the tomb of Lazarus. Yeah, well, Lazarus has been dead for 4 days, but dead is dead. And Jesus intervenes and speaks the word, and life comes back into this young man. Jesus saw the need. He initiated. The woman who was crippled for 18 years, she was in the synagogue. Jesus was there teaching, and in the midst of his teaching, he sees this woman. And apparently he stops his teaching and he says, would you come up here, please? Now, I'm not an expert on Jewish customs, but I understand the Jews kind of made some distinctions between men and women and who was allowed to be where and who was allowed to do what. I mean, they make movies about women who go to great lengths to try to be a man so they can learn more about the Torah. Some of you know that. Yentl, is that the name of it? Yes. This woman, obviously, in the back, called up to the front in the midst of this synagogue teaching, synagogue service. It says, when Jesus saw her, he called her and then spoke to her. Kind of reminds me a little bit of Jesus' words in Matthew 6 that Cheryl read for us earlier. Talking about our praying as part of that passage. And that our praying is not to try to somehow get God's attention, not to just keep babbling and repeating words over and over again and having the attitude that somehow we need to convince God to look our way so that we can tell him what's going on in our life. Jesus says to his disciples, don't be like those hypocrites, for your Father knows exactly what you need even before you ask him. He's not saying that we shouldn't ask, but he's reassuring us that he knows. He knew the woman's story who had just lost her son. He knew the woman's story who was crippled, had been that way for 18 years. Reminds me of the words of the prophet Isaiah in chapter 65, verse 24, where God said, I will answer them before they even call to me. While they are still talking about their needs, I will go ahead and answer their prayers. Sometimes, not always, sometimes Jesus answers even before we ask. Sometimes God answers even when we're not asking. I'm curious. We're not going to take time for you to answer, but I want you to think. Has there ever been a time in your life where God answered a need even before you asked? Or even when you weren't asking? Maybe you didn't even know to ask. I can think of three very distinct times in my life where I wasn't really asking. Where I wasn't really in a frame of mind. I wasn't asking for what God did, for the ways that God healed in my life. Had nothing to do with bringing life out of death, unless it was areas of death in my own spirit. Well, I shouldn't say unless it was. It was. God intervened. I wasn't asking where God brought life in areas that needed life. Just a little plug for being here. They all happen in church. One literally like this, a service, I didn't even want to be there. That's how much my heart was seeking and asking. I didn't want to be there. I'd made a commitment, and I had a rotten attitude about being there. I had agreed to do something, and I showed up, and there was hardly anybody there, and I'm just saying, I was completely out of sorts. Wishing I was somewhere else where my friends were. And God intervened, spoke to me very clearly and very powerfully in a way that changed my life. Another time was at a conference, a Promise Keepers conference. This one just for pastors. I said, well, you're already a pastor. What need do you have in your life? Don't kid yourself. Very soon after we moved here, God spoke very clearly. God intervened. God took the initiative. wasn't things that I was thinking about, okay, God, I really need help with this. And God exposed some attitudes, some things in me. And God brought life. God began a healing process in some areas in my own heart, even when I wasn't asking. The third time was at annual conference, Church of the Brethren annual conference. A few years after. And I definitely wasn't asking for what God did, the way that God showed up. The way that God showed me some things in my heart and brought life and healing. I wonder if you have stories about ways that God showed up in your life, about ways that God came, maybe through another person, maybe through some circumstance, maybe through something really difficult that you never would have chosen to walk through. But you look back, you say, God was in the midst, even in that circumstance. No, maybe God didn't cause it, but God was in the midst of it, and God has used it to bring life, to bring healing. That's part of what these two stories have in common, but there's more. In each of these cases, Jesus did for each woman what she could not have done for herself. Their lives were dramatically changed. That applies to my three stories. You say, well, could I have done them for my... Well, sometimes we're not even aware, and even sometimes when we are aware, we know that there's something that's broken inside of us, and we don't know how to flip the switch. We don't know how to just change it. Maybe we don't even know how to ask. And God sees, and God knows, and God cares. And God can intervene even before we ask. Third thing these stories have in common is that Jesus' intervention was prompted by compassion. The first story, it explicitly says that. Jesus saw this woman on her way to bury her dead son, and he had compassion for her. The second story doesn't say it in the same way, but still it says when he saw her, he called her to come, and he spoke to her with tenderness. Dear woman, he said, you are healed of your sickness. Jesus' compassion for them was a big part of his motivation in reaching out and bringing an end to their suffering and bringing them hope again, bringing them light again. Reminds me of the words in Hebrews 4 about Jesus, our high priest. It says, this high priest is one who understands our weaknesses, for he faced all of the same testings we do. He understands. He is moved with compassion. He cares about us and our needs, the ones that we know and the ones that we don't even realize. The last thing these stories have in common is that Jesus was also moved, was also motivated by a greater purpose. Shown more clearly in the second story. There was a purpose beyond these individuals. In the first story even, we read that there was a crowd there. There were other people watching this. And as this dead boy was raised back to life again, great awe and fear swept through the crowd. They praised God, saying, a mighty prophet has risen among us. God has visited his people today. They worshiped God. They gave God credit. News spread throughout the surrounding countryside. God had purpose in this beyond the woman. others who witnessed it, others who heard their story, even those of us here today, are part of God's purpose in this woman's story. Certainly the crippled woman. This happened in the synagogue on the Sabbath. Yes, it was for her and about her, but it wasn't only for her and about her. As soon as this woman was healed and this woman began praising God, the very next verse, but the leader of the synagogue, he wasn't quite so happy. In fact, the word here says he was indignant that Jesus had healed her on the Sabbath day. And listen to what he says. There are 6 days of the week for working, he said to the crowd. Come on those days to be healed, not on the Sabbath. Unless we judge too harshly, my guess is each one of us have been that ruler at some point in our lives with somebody less than compassionate, less than charitable in responding to someone else in their need. We won't take time this morning with all the different forms that attitude might take. Ways that we judge others. We make assumptions about others, what they can do, what they ought to do, what they should have done, what they shouldn't have done, why it's their fault they're in the predicament that they're in. A favorite one, which has some truth to it, but still isn't very compassionate, is these signs that say, your lack of planning does not constitute an emergency for me. Maybe not so different than this synagogue leader. But then Jesus replies to him, you hypocrites. Each of you works on the Sabbath day. Don't you untie your oxen or your donkey from its stall on Sabbath and lead it out for water? This dear woman, a daughter of Abraham, has been held in bondage by Satan for 18 years. Isn't it right that she be released even on the Sabbath? Luke adds, this shamed his enemies. But all the people rejoiced at the wonderful things he did. God had even a bigger purpose beyond this woman. And you know, at first we might say, well, it kind of takes away from it a little bit. I'd like to think that I was enough. I'd like to think that it was just a matter of God having compassion for me and that would be enough. But I don't think this cheapens the stories. I don't think this cheapens anything. Because I think that's another one of the needs that sometimes we don't even know we have. Not just to be comfortable, not just for the pain to be taken away, not just for our circumstances to change, but for our lives to matter. For our life to somehow be caught up, our story to somehow be caught up into God's story. And for God to use us, the pain, the healing, all of it, for God to somehow use that as part of his story to impact other people. It doesn't take away from the story. It adds to it. It gives even that much more to know that not only did God heal, but he used that healing to speak to others. I don't know about you, but that's what I long for. I long for God to heal those parts of me that I'm very aware of that need healing. I long for God to intervene even where I don't recognize it and to bring healing. And I long for God to take who I am and what I am and the successes, the failures, the whole story, and in whatever ways he can to use that. To use that for his glory and for the good of the world around me. Your Father knows exactly what you need, even before you ask. And he's at work. May not always understand his timing. We may not always understand what he allows in our life or why he waits so long. But we can trust him. Let him encounter you through these women's stories as their purpose continues to serve God's greater story in your life, in my life. May God be glorified as this encounter here this morning continues to do its work and to be yet another part of God's story for his glory, for the world's good.